Letter 5 of Letters from America by Rupert Brooke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Letter 5, Montreal and Ottawa. My American friends were full of kindly scorn when I announced that I was going to Canada. "A country without a soul!" they cried, and pressed books upon me to befriend me through that Philistine bleakness. Their commiseration unnerved me, but I was heartened by a feeling that I was in a sense going home, and by the romance of journeying. There was romance in the long grim American train, in the great lake we passed in the blackest of nights, and could just see glinting behind dark trees; in the negro car attendant; in the boy who perpetually cried "Peanuts! Candy!" up and down the long carriage; in the lofty box they put me in to sleep, and in the fat old lady who had the berth above mine, and snored shrilly the whole night through. There was almost romance, even, in the fact that after all there was no restaurant car on the train, and having walked all day in the country, I dined off an orange. I suppose an Englishman in another country, if he is simple enough, is continually and alternately struck by two thoughts: how like England this is, and how unlike England this is. When I had woken next morning, and lying on my back had got inside my clothes with a series of fish-like jumps, I found myself looking with startled eyes out of the window at the largest river I had ever seen. It was blue and sunlit, and it curved spaciously. But beyond that we ran into the squallider parts of a city. It became immediately obvious that we were not in New York or Boston, or any of the more orderly, the rather foreign, cities of America. There was something of the untidiness of those grimy houses, the smoky disorder of the back yards, that ran a thrill of nostalgia through me. I recognized the English way of doing things, with a difference that I could not define till later. Determined to be in all ways the complete tourist, I took a rough preliminary survey of Montreal in an observation car. It was a large motor wagonette, from which everything in Montreal could be seen in 2 hours. We were a most fortuitous band of 20 who had elected so to see it. Our guide addressed us from the front through a small megaphone, telling us what everything was, what we were to be interested in, what to overlook, and what to admire. He seemed the exact type of a spiritual pastor and master, shepherding his stolid and perplexed flock on a regulated path through the dust and clatter of the world. And the great hollow device out of which our instruction proceeded was so perfectly a blind mouth. I had never understood Lycidas before. We were sheepish enough and fairly hungry. However, we were excellently fed. "On the right, ladies and gentlemen, is the Bank of Montreal. On the left, the Presbyterian Church of St. Andrews. On the right again, the well-designed residence of Sir Blank Blank. Further on the other side, the Art Museum." The outcome of it all was a vague general impression that Montreal consists of banks and churches. The people of this city spend much of their time in laying up their riches in this world or the next. Indeed, the British part of Montreal is dominated by the Scotch race. There is a Scotch spirit sensible in the whole place, in the rather narrow, rather gloomy streets, the solid, square, gray, aggressively prosperous buildings, the general grayness of the city, the air of dour prosperity. Even the Canadian habit of loading the streets with heavy telephone wires, supported by frequent black poles, seemed to increase the atmospheric resemblance to Glasgow. But besides all this, there is a kind of restraint in the air, due perhaps to a state of affairs which, more than any other, startles the ordinary, ignorant English visitor. The average man in England has an idea of Canada as a young-eyed daughter state, composed of millions of wheat growers and backwoodsmen of British race. It surprises him to learn that more than a quarter of the population is of French descent, that many of them cannot speak English, that they control a province, form the majority in the biggest city in Canada, and are a perpetual complication in the national politics. Even a stranger who knows this is startled at the complete separateness of the two races. Intermarriage is very rare. They do not meet socially, only on business, and that not often. In the same city these two communities dwell side by side, with different traditions, different languages, different ideals, without sympathy or comprehension. The French in Canada are entirely devoted to, some say under the thumb of, the Roman Catholic Church. They seem like a piece of the Middle Ages, dumped after a trans-secular journey into a quite uncompromising example of our commercial time. Some of their leaders are said to have dreams of a French Republic, or theocracy, on the banks of the St Lawrence. How this, or any other solution of the problem is to come about, no man knows. Racial difficulties are the most enduring of all. The French and British in Canada seem to have behaved with quite extraordinary generosity and kindliness towards each other. No one is to blame. But it is not in human nature that two communities should live side by side, pretending they are one, without some irritation and mutual loss of strength. There is no open strife, but incidents, and the memory of incidents, bear continual witness to the truth of the situation. And racial disagreement is at the bottom, often unconsciously, of many political and social movements. Sir Wilfrid Laurier performed a miracle, but no one of French birth will ever again be Premier of Canada. Montreal and Eastern Canada suffer from that kind of ill health which afflicts men who are cases of double personality, debility and spiritual paralysis. The progressive British-Canadian man of commerce is comically desperate of peasants who will not understand that increase of imports and volume of trade and numbers of millionaires are the measure of a city's greatness, and to his eye the Roman Catholic Church, with her invaluable ally, ignorance, keeps up her incessant war against the general good of the community of which she is a part. And so things remain. I made my investigation in Montreal. I have to report that the Discobolus (footnote: see Samuel Butler's poem, O God, O Montreal, editor) is very well, and nowadays looks the whole world in the face, almost quite unabashed. West of Montreal the country seems to take on a rather more English appearance. There is still a French admixture, but the little houses are not purely Gallic, as they are along the lower St Lawrence, and once or twice I detected real hedges. Ottawa came as a relief after Montreal. There is no such sense of strain and tightness in the atmosphere. The British, if not greatly in the majority, are in the ascendancy. Also, the city seems conscious of other than financial standards, and quietly, with dignity, aware of her own purpose. The Canadians, like the Americans, chose to have for their capital a city which did not lead in population or in wealth. This is particularly fortunate in Canada, an extremely individualistic country, whose inhabitants are only just beginning to be faintly conscious of their nationality. Here, at least, Canada is more than the Canadian. A man desiring to praise Ottawa would begin to do so without statistics of wealth and the growth of population, and this can be said of no other city in Canada except Quebec. Not that there are not immense lumber mills and the rest in Ottawa, but the government farm and the Parliament buildings are more important. Also, although the spoils system obtains a good deal in this country, the nucleus of the civil service is much the same as in England, so there is an atmosphere of civil servants about Ottawa, an atmosphere of safeness and honor and massive buildings and well-shaded walks. After all, there is in the qualities of civility and service much beauty, of a kind which would adorn Canada. Parliament buildings stand finely on a headland off cliff, some 160 feet above the river. There are gardens about them, and beneath, the wooded rocks go steeply down to the water. It is a position of natural boldness and significance. The buildings were put up in the middle of the last century, an unfortunate period; but they have dignity, especially of line; and when evening hides their colour, and the western sky and the river take on the lovely hues of a Canadian sunset, and the lights begin to come out in the city, they seem to have the majesty and calm of a natural crown of the river headland. The government have bought the ground along the cliff for half a mile on either side, and propose to build all their offices there. So, in the end, if they build well, the river front of Ottawa will be a noble sight. And, just to show that it is Canada and not Utopia, the line of national buildings will always be broken by an expensive and superb hotel the Canadian Pacific Railway has been allowed to erect on the twin and neighbouring promontory to that of the Houses of Parliament. The streets of Ottawa are very quiet and shaded with trees. The houses are mostly of that cool, homely, wooden kind, with verandahs, on which, or on the steps, the whole family may sit in the evening and observe the passers by. This is possible for both the rich and the poor, who live nearer each other in Ottawa than in most cities. In general, there is an air of civilization, which extends even over the country round. But in the country you see little signs, a patch of swamp, or thickets of still untouched primeval wood, which remind you that Europeans have not long had this land. I was taken in a motor car some 20 miles or more over the execrable roads round here, to a lovely little lake in the hills northwest of Ottawa. We went by little French villages and fields at first, and then through rocky, tangled woods of birch and poplar, rich with milkweed and blue cornflowers, and the aromatic thimbleberry blossom, and that romantic, light purple-red flower which is called fireweed, because it is the first vegetation to spring up in the prairie after a fire has passed over, and so might be adopted as the emblematic flower of a sense of humour. They told me, casually, that there was nothing but a few villages between me and the North Pole. It is probably true of several commonly frequented places in this country, but it gives a thrill to hear it. But what Ottawa leaves in the mind is a certain graciousness, dim, for it expresses a barely materialized national spirit, and the sight of kindly English-looking faces, and the rather lovely sound of the soft Canadian accent in the streets. End of Letter 5. Letter 6 of Letters from America by Rupert Brooke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Letter 6, Quebec and the Saguenay. The boat starts from Montreal one evening and lands you in Quebec at 6 next morning. The evening I left was a dull one. Heavy, sulphurous clouds hung low over the city, drifting very slowly and gloomily out across the river. Mount Royal crouched black and sullen in the background, its crest occluded by the darkness, appearing itself a cloud materialized, resting on earth. The harbor was filled with volumes of smoke, purple and black, wreathing and sidling eastwards from steamers and chimneys. The gigantic elevators and other harbor buildings stood mistily in this inferno, their heads clear and sinister above the murk. It was impossible to decide whether an enormous mass of pitchy and Tartarian gloom was being slowly molded by diabolic invisible hands into a city, or a city, the desperate and damned abode of a loveless race, was disintegrating into its proper fume and dusty chaos. With relief we turned outwards to the nobility of the Lawrence and the gathering dark. On the boat I fell in with another wanderer, an American Jew, and we joined our fortunes, rather loosely, for a few days. He was one of those men whom it is a lifelong pleasure to remember. I can record his existence the more easily that there is not the slightest chance of his ever reading these lines. He was a fat, large man of 45, obviously in business and probably of a mediocre success. His eyes were light-colored, very small, always watery, and perpetually roving. The lower part of his face was clean-shaven and very broad, his mouth wide, with thin, moist, colorless lips; his nose fat and Hebraic. He was rather bald. He had respect for Montreal, because, though closed to navigation for 5 months in the year, it is the second busiest port on the coast. He said it had Boston skinned. The French he disliked. He thought they stood in the way of Canada's progress. His mind was even more childlike and transparent than is usual with business men. The observer could see thoughts slowly floating into it, like carp in a pond. When they got near the surface, by a purely automatic process they found utterance. He was almost completely unconscious of an audience. Everything he thought of he said. He told me that his boots were giving in the sole, but would probably last this trip. He said he had not washed his feet for 8 days, and that his clothes were shabby, which was true, but would do for Canada. It was interesting to see how Canada presented herself to that mind. He seemed to regard her as a kind of Boeotia, and terribly dour. "These Canadian waiters," he said, "they jest fling the food in your face. Kinder gets you sick, doesn't it?" I agreed. There was a Yorkshire mechanic, too, who had been in Canada 4 years and preferred it to England, "because you've room to breathe," but also found that Canada had not yet learnt social comfort, and regretted the manners of the old country. We woke to find ourselves sweeping round a high cliff at 6 in the morning, with a lively breeze, the river very blue and broken into ripples, and a lot of little white clouds in the sky. The air was full of gaiety and sunshine, and the sense of the singing of birds, though actually, I think, there were only a few gulls crying. It was the perfection of a summer morning, thrilling with a freshness which, the fancy said, was keener than any the old world knew. And high and gray and serene above the morning lay the Citadel of Quebec. Is there any city in the world that stands so nobly as Quebec? The Citadel crowns a headland 300 feet high that juts boldly out into the St Lawrence. Up to it, up the side of the hill, clambers the city, houses and steeples and huts, piled one on the other. It has the individuality and the pride of a city where great things have happened and over which many years have passed. Quebec is as refreshing and as definite after the other cities of this continent as an immortal among a crowd of stockbrokers. She has, indeed, the radiance and repose of an immortal, but she wears her immortality youthfully. When you get among the streets of Quebec, the medieval, precipitous, narrow, winding, and perplexed streets, you begin to realize her charm. She almost incurs the charge of quaintness, abhorrent quality, but even quaintness becomes attractive in this country. You are in a foreign land, for the people have an alien tongue, short stature, the quick, decided, cinematographic quality of movement, and the inexplicable cheerfulness which mark a foreigner. You might almost be in Siena or some old German town, except that Quebec has her street cars and grain elevators to show that she is living. The American Jew and I took a calèche, a little 2-wheeled local carriage driven by a lively Frenchman with a factitious passion for death spots and churches. A small black and white spaniel followed the calèche, yapping. The American's face shone with interest. "That dog's Michael," he said, "the hotel dog. He's a queer little dog. I kicked his face and he tried to bite me. Bet, Michael!" And he laughed hoarsely. "Non," said the driver suddenly, "it is not the hotel dog." The American did not lose interest. "These little dogs are all alike," he said. "Dare say if you kicked that dog in the face he'd bite you, eh, Michael?" With that he fell into deep thought. We rattled up and down the steep streets, out among tidy fields, and back into the noisily sedate city again. We saw where Wolfe fell, where Montcalm fell, where Montgomery fell. Children played where the tides of war had ebbed and flowed. Mr. Norman Angell and his friends tell us that trade is superseding war, and pacifists declare that for the future countries will win their pride or shame from commercial treaties and tariffs and bounties, and no more from battles and sieges. And there is a part of Canadian patriotism that has progressed this way. But I wonder if the hearts of that remarkable race, posterity, will ever beat the harder when they are told, "Here Mr. Borden stood when he decided to double the duty on agricultural implements," or even, "In this room Mr. Ritchie conceived the plan of removing the shilling on wheat." When that happens, Quebec will be a forgotten ruin. The reverie was broken by my friend, struggling to his feet and standing unsteady and bareheaded in the swaying carriage. In that position he burst hoarsely into a song that I recognized as "The Star-Spangled Banner." We were passing the American consulate. His song over, he settled down and fell into a deep sleep, and the caleche jolted down even narrower streets, curiously paved with planks, and ways that led through and under the ancient, tottering wooden houses. But Quebec is too real a city to be seen in such a manner, and a better way of spending a few days or years is to sit on Dufferin Terrace, with the old lower town sheer beneath you, and the river beyond it, and the Citadel to the right, a little above, and the Isle of Orleans and the French village away downstream to your left. Hour by hour the colors change, and sunlight follows shadow, and mist rises, and smoke drifts across. And through the veil of the shifting of lights and hues there remains visible the majesty of the most glorious river in the world. From this contemplation, and from musing on men's agreement to mark by this one great sign of the taking of the heights of Quebec the turning of one of the greatest currents in our history, I was torn by a journey I had been advised to make. The boat goes some 130 miles down the St Lawrence, turns up a northern tributary, the Saguenay, goes as far as Chicoutimi, 90 miles up, and returns to Quebec. Both on this trip and between Quebec and Montreal we touched at many little French villages by day and by night. Their habitants, the French-Canadian peasants, are a jolly sight. They are like children in their noisy content. They are poor and happy, Roman Catholics. They laugh a great deal, and they continually sing. They do not progress at all. As a counter to these admirable people, we had on our boat a great many priests. They diffused an atmosphere of black, of unpleasant melancholy. Their faces had that curiously unwashed look, and were for the most part of a mean and very untrustworthy expression. Their eyes were small, shifty, and cruel, and would not meet the gaze. The choice between our own age and medieval times is a very hard one. It was almost full night when we left the 20-mile width of the St Lawrence and turned up a gloomy inlet. By reason of the night and of comparison with the river from which we had come, this stream appeared unnaturally narrow. Darkness hid all detail, and we were only aware of vast cliffs, sometimes dense with trees, sometimes bare faces of sullen rock. They shut us in oppressively, but without heat. There were no banks to this river, for the most part, only these walls rising sheer from the water to the height of 2,000 feet, going down sheer beneath it, or rather by the side of it, to many times that depth. The water was of some color blacker than black. Even by daylight it is inky and sinister. It flows without foam or ripple. No white showed in the wake of the boat. The ominous shores were without sign of life, save for a rare light every few miles to mark some bend in the chasm. Once a canoe with 2 Indians shot out of the shadows, passed under our stern, and vanished silently downstream. We all became hushed and apprehensive. The night was gigantic and terrible. There were a few stars, but the flood tide slid along too swiftly to reflect them. The whole scene seemed some Stygian imagination of Dante. As we drew further and further into the lightless land, little twists and curls of vapor wriggled over the black river surface. Our homeless, irrelevant, tiny steamer seemed to hang between two abysms. One became suddenly aware of the miles of dark water beneath. I found that under a prolonged gaze the face of the river began to writhe and eddy, as if from some horrible suppressed emotion. It seemed likely that something might appear. I reflected that if the river failed us, all hope was gone, and that anyhow this region was the abode of devils. I went to bed. Next day we steamed down the river again. By daylight some of the horror goes, but the impression of ancientness and desolation remains. The gloomy flood is entirely shut in by the rock or the tangled pine and birch forests of these great cliffs, except in one or two places where a chine and a beach have given lodging to lonely villages. One of these is at the end of a long bay called Ha Ha Bay. The local guidebook, an early example of the school of fantastic realism so popular among our younger novelists, says that this name arose from the laughing ejaculations of the early French explorers, who had mistaken this lengthy blind alley for the main stream. "Ha ha," they said, so like an early explorer. At the point where the Saguenay joins the St Lawrence, here 20 miles wide, I stopped off for a day to feel the country more deeply. The village is called Tadoussac, and consists of an hotel and French fishermen to whom Quebec is a distant, unvisited city of legend. The afternoon was very hot. I wandered out along a thin margin of yellow sand to the extreme rocky point where the waters of the two rivers meet and swirl. There I lay and looked at the strange humps of the Laurentian hills, and the dark green masses of the woods, impenetrable depths of straight and leaning and horizontal trees, broken here and there by great bald granite rocks, and behind me the little village where the earliest church in Canada stands. Away in the St Lawrence there would be a flash as an immense white fish jumped. Miles out an occasional steamer passed, bound to England perhaps, and once, hugging the coast, came a half-breed paddling a canoe with a small diamond-shaped sail filled with trout. The cliff above me was crowned with beds of blue flowers whose names I did not know. Against the little gulfs and coasts of rock at my feet were washing a few white logs of driftwood. I wondered if they could have floated across from England, or if they could be from the Titanic. The sun was very hot, the sky a clear light blue, almost cloudless, like an English sky, and the water seemed fairly deep. I stripped, hovered a while on the bank, and plunged. The current was unexpectedly strong. I seemed to feel that 2-mile deep body of black water moving against me, and it was cold as death. Stray shreds of the St Lawrence water were warm and cheerful, but the current of the Saguenay on such a day seemed unnaturally icy. As my head came up, I made one dash for the land, scrambled out on the hot rocks, and lay there panting. Then I dried on a handkerchief, dressed, and ran back home, still shivering, through the woods to the hotel. End of Letter 6. Letter 7 of Letters from America by Rupert Brooke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Letter 7, Ontario. The great joy of traveling in Canada is to do it by water. The advantage of this is that you can keep fairly clean and quiet of nerves. The disadvantage is that you don't see the country. I traveled most of the way from Ottawa to Toronto by water. But between Ottawa and Prescott, then and later from Toronto to Niagara Falls, and thence to Sarnia, there is a good deal of southern Ontario to be seen, the part which has counted as Ontario so far. And I saw it through a faint gray-pink mist of Heimweh. For after the States and after Quebec, it is English. There are weather-beaten farm-houses, rolling country, thickets of trees, little hills, green and gray in the distance, decorous small fields, orchards, and, I swear, a hedge or two. Most of the towns we went through are a little too vivacious or too pert to be European, but there seemed to be real villages occasionally, and the land had a quiet air of occupation. Men have lived contentedly on this land and died where they were born, and so given it a certain sanctity. Away north the wild begins, and is only now being brought into civilization, inhabited, made productive, explored and exploited. But this country has seen the generations pass and won something of that repose and security which countries acquire from the sight. The wise traveler from Ottawa to Toronto catches a boat at Prescott and puffs judicially between two nations up the St Lawrence and across Lake Ontario. We were a cosmopolitan, middle-class bunch. It is the one distinction between the Canadian and American languages that Canadians tend to say bunch, but Americans crowd, out to enjoy the scenery. For this stretch of the river is notoriously picturesque, containing the Thousand Isles. The Thousand Isles vary from 6 inches to hundreds of yards in diameter. Each, if big enough, has been bought by a rich man, generally an American, who has built a castle on it. So the whole isn't much more beautiful than Golders Green. We picked our way carefully between the islands. The Americans on board sat in rows, saying, "That house was built by Mr. Blank. Made his money in biscuits. Cost $300,000. Erecting that building. Yes, sir." The Canadians sat looking out the other way and said, "In 1910 this land was worth $20,000 an acre. Now it's worth $45,000. Next year—" and their eyes grew solemn as the eyes of men who think deep and holy thoughts. But the English sat quite still, looking straight in front of them, thinking of nothing at all, and hoping that nobody would speak to them. So we fared, until well on in the afternoon we came to the entrance of Lake Ontario. There is something ominous and unnatural about these great lakes. The sweet flow of a river and the unfriendly, restless vitality of the sea men may know and love, and the little lakes we have in Europe are but as freshwater streams that have married and settled down, alive and healthy and comprehensible. Rivers, except the Saguenay, are human. The sea, very properly, will not be allowed in heaven. It has no soul. It is unvintageable, cruel, treacherous, what you will. But in the end, while we have it with us, it is all right, even though that all rightness result but, as with France, from the recognition of an age-long feud and an irremediable lack of sympathy. But these monstrous lakes which ape the ocean are not proper to fresh water or salt. They have souls, perceptibly, and wicked ones. We steamed out that day over a flat stationary mass of water, smooth with the smoothness of metal or polished stone or one's fingernail. There was a slight haze everywhere. The lake was a terrible dead silver color. The gleam of its surface shot with flecks of blue and a vapory enamel green. It was like a gigantic silver shield. Its glint was inexplicably sinister and dead, like the glint on glasses worn by a blind man. In front, the steely mist hid the horizon, so that the occasional rock or little island and the one ship in sight seemed hung in air. They were reflected to a preternatural length in the glassy floor. Our boat appeared to leave no wake. Those strange waters closed up foamlessly behind her. But our black smoke hung, away back on the trail, in a thick, clearly bounded cloud, becalmed in the hot, windless air, very close over the water, like an evil soul after death that cannot win dissolution. Behind us and to the right lay the low, woody shores of southern Ontario and Prince Edward Peninsula, long, dark lines of green stretching thinner and thinner, interminably, into the distance. The lake around us was dull, though the sun shone full on it. It gleamed, but without radiance. Toronto, pronounced Tronto, please, is difficult to describe. It has an individuality, but an elusive one, yet not through any queerness or difficult shade of eccentricity, a subtly normal and indefinably obvious personality. It is a healthy, cheerful city, by modern standards. A clean-shaven, pink-faced, respectably dressed, fairly energetic, unintellectual, passably sociable, well-to-do, public school and varsity sort of city. One knows in one's own life certain bright and pleasant figures, people who occupy the nearer middle distance, unobtrusive but not negligible, wardens of the marches between acquaintanceship and friendship. It is always nice to meet them, and in parting one looks back at them once. They are healthily and simply the most fitting product of a not perfect environment, good sorts, normal but not too normal, distinctly themselves but not distinguished. They support civilization. You can trust them in anything, if your demand be for nothing extremely intelligent or absurdly altruistic. One of these could be exhibited in any gallery in the universe. Perfect specimen, upper middle classes, 20th century. And we should not be ashamed. They are not vexed by impossible dreams, nor outrageously materialistic, nor perplexed by overmuch prosperity, nor spoilt by reverse. Souls for whom the wind is always nor'-nor'-west, and they sail nearer success than failure, and nearer wisdom than lunacy. Neither leaders nor slaves, but no Tomlinsons, whomsoever of your friends you miss, them you will certainly meet again, not unduly pardoned, the 51st by the throne. Such is Toronto, a brisk city of getting on for 500,000 inhabitants, the largest British city in Canada, in spite of the cheery Italian faces that pop up at you out of the excavations in the street, liberally endowed with millionaires, not lacking its due share of destitution, misery, and slums. It is no mushroom city of the West. It has its history, but at the same time it has grown immensely of recent years. It is situated on the shores of a lovely lake, but you never see that, because the railways have occupied the entire lake front. So if, at evening, you try to find your way to the edge of the water, you are checked by a region of smoke, sheds, trucks, wharves, storehouses, depots, railway lines, signals and locomotives and trains that wander on the tracks up and down and across streets, pushing their way through the pedestrians and tolling, as they go, in the American fashion, an immense melancholy bell, intent, apparently, on some private and incommunicable grief. Higher up are the business quarters, a few skyscrapers in the American style, without the modern American beauty, but one of which advertises itself as the highest in the British Empire. Streets that seem less narrow than Montreal, but not unrespectably wide. The buildings are generally substantial and often handsome, the too kindly Herr Baedeker. Beyond that, the residential part, with quiet streets, gardens open to the road, shady verandas, and homes, generally of wood, that are a deal more pleasant to see than the houses in a modern English town. Toronto is the centre and heart of the province of Ontario, and Ontario, with a third of the whole population of Canada, directs the country for the present, conditioned by the French on one hand and the West on the other. And in this land, that is as yet hardly at all conscious of itself as a nation, Toronto and Ontario do their best in leading and realizing national sentiment. A Toronto man, like most Canadians, dislikes an Englishman, but unlike some Canadians, he detests an American. And he has some inkling of the conditions and responsibilities of the British Empire. The tradition is in him. His fathers fought to keep Canada British. It is never easy to pick out of the turmoil of an election the real powers that have moved men, and it is especially difficult in a country where politics are so corrupt as they are in Canada. But certainly this British feeling helped to throw Ontario, and so the country, against reciprocity with the United States in 1911. And it is keeping it, in the comedy of the Navy question, on Mr. Borden's side, rather from distrust of his opponent's sincerity, perhaps, than from admiration of the fix he is in. It has been used, this patriotism, to aid the wealthy interests which are powerful here, and it will continue to be a ball in the tennis of party politics. But it is real, it will remain, potential of good, among all the forces that are certain for evil. Toronto, soul of Canada, is wealthy, busy, commercial, Scotch, absorbent of whisky. But she is duly aware of other things. She has a most modern and efficient interest in education, and here are gathered what faint beginnings or premonitions of such things as Art Canada can boast, except the French Canadians, who, it is complained, produce disproportionately much literature and waste their time on their own unprofitable songs. Most of those few who have begun to paint the landscape of Canada centre there, and a handful of people who know about books. In these things, as in all, the city is properly and cheerfully to the front. It can scarcely be doubted that the first repertory theatre in Canada will be founded in Toronto some 30 years hence, and will very daringly perform Candida and The Silver Box. Canada is a live country, live, but not, like the States, kicking. In these trifles of art and culture, indeed, she is much handicapped by the proximity of the States, for her poets and writers are apt to be drawn thither for the better companionship there and the higher rates of pay. But Toronto is the subject. One must say something. What must one say about Toronto? What can one? What has anybody ever said? It is impossible to give it anything but commendation. It is not squalid like Birmingham, or cramped like Canton, or scattered like Edmonton, or sham like Berlin, or hellish like New York, or tiresome like Nice. It is all right. The only depressing thing is that it will always be what it is, only larger, and that no Canadian city can ever be anything better or different. If they are good, they may become Toronto. End of Letter 7. Letter 8 of Letters from America by Rupert Brooke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Letter 8, Niagara Falls. Samuel Butler has a lot to answer for. But for him, a modern traveler could spend his time peacefully admiring the scenery instead of feeling himself bound to dog the simple and grotesque of the world for the sake of their too human comments. It is his fault if a peasant's naïveté has come to outweigh the beauty of rivers, and the remarks of clergymen are more than mountains. It is very restful to give up all effort at observing human nature and drawing social and political deductions from trifles, and to let oneself relapse into wide-mouthed worship of the wonders of nature. And this is very easy at Niagara. Niagara means nothing. It is not leading anywhere. It does not result from anything. It throws no light on the effects of protection, nor on the facility for divorce in America, nor on corruption in public life, nor on Canadian character, nor even on the Navy Bill. It is merely a great deal of water falling over some cliffs. But it is very remarkably that. The human race, apt as a child to destroy what it admires, has done its best to surround the Falls with every distraction, incongruity, and vulgarity. Hotels, power-houses, bridges, trams, picture postcards, sham legends, stalls, booths, rifle galleries, and side-shows frame them about. And there are touts. Niagara is the central home and breeding place for all the touts of earth. There are touts insinuating and touts raucous, greasy touts, brazen touts, and upper-class, refined, gentlemanly, take-you-by-the-arm touts. Touts who intimidate and touts who wheedle, professionals, amateurs, and dilettanti, male and female, touts who would photograph you with your arm around a young lady against a faked background of the sublimest cataract, touts who would bully you into cars, char à bancs, elevators, or tunnels, or deceive you into a carriage and pair, touts who would sell you picture postcards, moccasins, sham Indian beadwork, blankets, teepees, and crockery, and touts, finally, who have no apparent object in the world, but just purely, simply, merely, incessantly, indefatigably, and ineffugibly to tout. And in the midst of all this, overwhelming it all, are the Falls. He who sees them instantly forgets humanity. They are not very high, but they are overpowering. They are divided by an island into two parts, the Canadian and the American. Half a mile or so above the Falls on either side, the water of the great stream begins to run more swiftly and in confusion. It descends with ever-growing speed. It begins chattering and leaping, breaking into 1,000 ripples, throwing up joyful fingers of spray. Sometimes it is divided by islands and rocks. Sometimes the eye can see nothing but a waste of laughing, springing, foamy waves, turning, crossing, even seeming to stand for an instant erect, but always borne impetuously forward like a crowd of triumphant feasters. Sit close down by it, and you see a fragment of the torrent against the sky, mottled, steely, and foaming, leaping onward in far-flung, criss-cross strands of water. Perpetually the eye is on the point of descrying a pattern in this weaving, and perpetually it is cheated by change. In one place, part of the flood plunges over a ledge a few feet high and 1/4 of a mile or so long in a uniform and stable curve. It gives you an impression of almost military concerted movement, grown suddenly out of confusion. But it is swiftly lost again in the multitudinous, tossing merriment. Here and there a rock close to the surface is marked by a white wave that faces backwards and seems to be rushing madly upstream, but is really stationary in the headlong charge. But for these signs of reluctance, the waters seem to fling themselves on with some foreknowledge of their fate in an ever wilder frenzy. But it is no Maeterlinckian prescience. They prove, rather, that Greek belief that the great crashes are preceded by a louder merriment and a wilder gaiety. Leaping in the sunlight, careless, entwining, clamorously joyful, the waves riot on towards the verge. But there they change. As they turn to the sheer descent, the white and blue and slate color, in the heart of the Canadian Falls at least, blend and deepen to a rich, wonderful, luminous green. On the edge of disaster the river seems to gather herself, to pause, to lift a head noble in ruin, and then with a slow grandeur to plunge into the eternal thunder and white chaos below. Where the stream runs shallower it is a kind of violet color, but both violet and green fray and frill to white as they fall. The mass of water, striking some ever-hidden base of rock, leaps up the whole 200 feet again in pinnacles and domes of spray. The spray falls back into the lower river once more. All but a little that fines to foam and white mist, which drifts in layers along the air, graining it, and wanders out on the wind over the trees and gardens and houses, and so vanishes. The manager of one of the great power stations on the banks of the river above the Falls told me that the center of the river bed at the Canadian Falls is deep and of a saucer shape. So it may be possible to fill this up to a uniform depth and divert a lot of water for the power houses. And this, he said, would supply the need for more power, which will certainly soon arise, without taking away from the beauty of Niagara. This is a handsome concession of the utilitarians to ordinary sightseers. Yet I doubt if we shall be satisfied. The real secret of the beauty and terror of the Falls is not their height or width, but the feeling of colossal power and of unintelligible disaster caused by the plunge of that vast body of water. If that were taken away, there would be little visible change, but the heart would be gone. The American Falls do not inspire this feeling in the same way as the Canadian. It is because they are less in volume, and because the water does not fall so much into one place. By comparison, their beauty is almost delicate and fragile. They are extraordinarily level, one long curtain of lacework and woven foam. Seen from opposite, when the sun is on them, they are blindingly white, and the clouds of spray show dark against them. With both falls, the color of the water is the ever-altering wonder. Greens and blues, purples and whites, melt into one another, fade and come again, and change with the changing sun. Sometimes they are as richly diaphanous as a precious stone, and glow from within with a deep, inexplicable light. Sometimes the white intricacies of dropping foam become opaque and creamy. And always there are the rainbows. If you come suddenly upon the Falls from above, a great double rainbow, very vivid, spanning the extent of spray from top to bottom, is the first thing you see. If you wander along the cliff opposite, a bow springs into being in the American Falls, accompanies you courteously on your walk, dwindles and dies as the mist ends, and awakens again as you reach the Canadian tumult. And the bold traveler who attempts the trip under the American Falls sees, when he dare open his eyes to anything, tiny baby rainbows, some 4 or 5 yards in span, leaping from rock to rock among the foam, and gambolling beside him, barely out of hand's reach as he goes. One I saw in that place was a complete circle, such as I have never seen before, and so near that I could put my foot on it. It is a terrifying journey, beneath and behind the Falls. The senses are battered and bewildered by the thunder of the water and the assault of wind and spray. Or rather, the sound is not of falling water, but merely of falling, a noise of unspecified ruin. So if you are close behind the endless clamor, the sight cannot recognize liquid in the masses that hurl past. You are dimly and pitifully aware that sheets of light and darkness are falling in great curves in front of you. Dull, omnipresent foam washes the face. Farther away, in the roar and hissing, clouds of spray seem literally to slide down some invisible plane of air. Beyond the foot of the Falls, the river is like a slipping floor of marble, green with veins of dirty white, made by the scum that was foam. It slides very quietly and slowly down for a mile or two, sullenly exhausted. Then it turns to a dull sage green and hurries more swiftly, smooth and ominous. As the walls of the ravine close in, trouble stirs, and the waters boil and eddy. These are the lower rapids, a sight more terrifying than the Falls, because less intelligible. Close in its bands of rock, the river surges tumultuously forward, writhing and leaping as if inspired by a demon. It is pressed by the straits into a visibly convex form. Great plains of water slide past. Sometimes it is thrown up into a pinnacle of foam higher than a house, or leaps with incredible speed from the crest of one vast wave to another, along the shining curve between, like the spring of a wild beast. Its motion continually suggests muscular action. The power manifest in these rapids moves one with a different sense of awe and terror from that of the Falls. Here the inhuman life and strength are spontaneous, active, almost resolute. Masculine vigor compared with the passive gigantic power, female, helpless and overwhelming, of the Falls. A place of fear. One is drawn back strangely to a contemplation of the Falls at every hour, and especially by night, when the cloud of spray becomes an immense visible ghost, straining and wavering high above the river, white and pathetic and translucent. The Victorian lies very close below the surface in every man. There one can sit and let great cloudy thoughts of destiny and the passage of empires drift through the mind, for such dreams are at home by Niagara. I could not get out of my mind the thought of a friend who said that the rainbows over the Falls were like the arts and beauty and goodness with regard to the stream of life, caused by it, thrown upon its spray, but unable to stay or direct or affect it, and ceasing when it ceased. In all comparisons that rise in the heart, the river, with its multitudinous waves and its single current, likens itself to a life, whether of an individual or of a community. A man's life is of many flashing moments, and yet one stream. A nation's flows through all its citizens, and yet is more than they. In such places one is aware, with an almost insupportable and yet comforting certitude, that both men and nations are hurried onwards to their ruin, or ending as inevitably as this dark flood. Some go down to it unreluctant, and meet it like the river, not without nobility; and as incessant, as inevitable, and as unavailing as the spray that hangs over the Falls, is the white cloud of human crying. With some such thoughts does the platitudinous heart win from the confusion and thunder of Niagara a peace that the quietest plains or most stable hills can never give. End of Letter 8. Letter 9 of Letters from America by Rupert Brooke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Letter 9 to Winnipeg. The boats that run from Sarnia, the whole length of Lake Huron and Lake Superior, are not comfortable, but no doubt a train for those 600 miles would be worse. You start one afternoon, and in the morning of the next day you have done with the rather colorless, unindividual expanses of Huron, and are dawdling along a canal that joins the lakes by the little town of Sault Ste. Marie (pronounced abruptly Sioux). We happened on it one Sunday. The nearer waters of the river and the lakes were covered with little sailing or rowing or bathing parties. Everybody seemed cheerful, merry, and mildly raucous. There is a fine, breezy, enviable healthiness about Canadian life. Except in some Eastern cities, there are few clerks or working men but can get away to the woods and water. As we drew out into the cold magnificence of Lake Superior, the receding woody shores were occasionally spotted with picnickers or campers, who rushed down the beach in various deshabilles, waving towels, handkerchiefs, or garments. We were as friendly, the human race seemed a jolly bunch, and the world a fine, pleasant, open-air affair. Some world, in fact. A man in a red shirt and a bronzed girl with flowing hair slid past in a canoe. We whistled and sang and cried "Snooky-yookums" and other words of occult meaning, which imputed love to them and foolishness. They replied suitably, grinned, and were gone. A little old lady in black, in the chair next to mine, kept a small telescope glued to her eye, hour after hour. Whenever she distinguished life on any shore we passed, she waved a tiny handkerchief. Diligently she did this, and with grave face, never visible to the objects of her devotion, I suppose, but certainly very happy. The most persistent lover of humanity I have ever seen. In the afternoon we were beyond sight of land. The world grew a little chilly, and over the opaque, hueless water came sliding a queer, pale mist. We strained through it for hours, a low bank of cloud not 20 feet in height, on which one could look down from the higher deck. Its upper surface was quite flat and smooth, save for innumerable tiny molehills or pyramids of mist. We seem to be plowing aimlessly through the phantasmal sand dunes of another world, faintly and by an accident apprehended. So may the shades on a ghostly liner plunging down Lethe have an hour's chance glimpse of the lights and lives of Piccadilly, to them uncertain and filmy mirages of the air. To taste the full deliciousness of traveling in an American train by night through new scenery, you must carefully secure a lower berth. And when you are secret and separate in your little oblong world, safe between sheets, pull up the blinds on the great window a few inches and leave them so. Thus, as you lie, you can view the dark procession of woods and hills, and mingle the broken hours of railway slumber with glimpses of a wild starlit landscape. The country retains individuality and yet puts on romance, especially the rough shaggy region between Port Arthur and Winnipeg. For 400 miles there's hardly a sign that humanity exists on the earth's face, only rocks and endless woods of scrubby pine, and the occasional strange gleam of water, and night and the wind. Night long, dream and reality mingle. You may wake from sleep to find yourself flying through a region where a forest fire has passed, a place of gray pine trunks, stripped of foliage, occasionally waving a naked bough. They appear stricken by calamity, intolerably bare and lonely, gaunt, perpetually protesting, amazed and tragic creatures. We saw no actual fire the night I passed, but a little while after dawn we noticed on the horizon, 15 miles away, an immense column of smoke. There was little wind, and it hung, as if sculptured, against the gray of the morning. Nor did we lose sight of it till just before we boomed over a wide, swift, muddy river into the flat city of Winnipeg. Winnipeg is the West. It is important and obvious that in Canada there are 2 or 3, some say 5, distinct Canadas. Even if you lump the French and the English together as one community in the East, there remains the Gulf of the Great Lakes. The difference between East and West is simply no greater than that between North and South England, or Bavaria and Prussia. But in this country, yet unconscious of itself, there is so much less to hold them together. The character of the land and the people differs. Their interests, as it appears to them, are not the same. Winnipeg is a new city. In the archives at Ottawa is a picture of Winnipeg in 1870, Main Street with a few shacks and the prairie either end. Now her population is 100,000, and she has the biggest this, that, and the other west of Toronto. A new city, a little more American than the other Canadian cities, but not unpleasantly so. The streets are wider and full of a bustle which keeps clear of hustle. The people have something of the free swing of Americans without the bumptiousness, a tempered democracy, a mitigated independence of bearing. The manners of Winnipeg, of the West, impress the stranger as better than those of the East, more friendly, more hearty, more certain to achieve graciousness, if not grace. There is even in the architecture of Winnipeg a sort of gauche pride visible. It is hideous, of course, even more hideous than Toronto or Montreal, but cheerily and windily so. There is no scheme in the city and no beauty, but it is at least preferable to Birmingham, less dingy, less directly depressing. It has no real slums, even though there is poverty and destitution. But there seems to be a trifle more public spirit in the West than the East. Perhaps it is that in the greater eagerness and confidence of this newer country, men have a superfluity of energy and interest, even after attending to their own affairs, to give to the community. Perhaps it is that the West is so young that one has a suspicion money-making has still some element of a child's game in it, its only excuse. At any rate, whether because the state of affairs is yet unsettled, or because of the invisible subtle spirit of optimism that blows through the heavily clustering telephone wires and past the neat little modern villas and down the solidly pretentious streets, one can't help finding a tiny hope that Winnipeg, the city of buildings and the city of human beings, may yet come to something. It is a slender hope, not to be compared to that of the true Winnipeg man, who, gazing on his city, is fired with the proud and secret ambition that it will soon be twice as big, and after that 4 times, and then 10 times. "Wider still and wider shall thy bounds be set," says that hymn, which is the noblest expression of modern ambition. That hope is sure to be fulfilled. But the other timid prayer that something different, something more worth having, may come out of Winnipeg exists, and not quite unreasonably. That cannot be said of Toronto. Winnipeg is of the West, new, vigorous in its way, of unknown potentialities. Already the West has been a nuisance to the East, in the fight of 1911 over reciprocity with the United States. When she gets a larger representation in Parliament, she will still be more of a nuisance. A casual traveler cannot venture to investigate the beliefs and opinions of the inhabitants of a country, but he can record them all the better, perhaps, for his foreignness. It is generally believed in the West that the East runs Canada, and runs it for its own advantage. And the East means a very few rich men, who control the big railways, the banks, and the Manufacturers' Association, subscribe to both political parties, and are generally credited with complete control over the tariff and most other Canadian affairs. Whether or no the Manufacturers' Association does arrange the tariff and control the commerce of Canada, it is generally believed to do so. The only thing is that its friends say that it acts in the best interests of Canada, its enemies that it acts in the best interests of the Manufacturers' Association. Among its enemies are many in the West. The normal Western life is a lonely and individual one, and a large part of the population has crossed from the United States, or belongs to that great mass of European immigration that Canada is letting so blindly in. So naturally the Westerner does not feel the same affection for the Empire or for England as the British Canadians of the East, whose forefathers fought to stay within the Empire. Nor is his affection increased by the suspicion that the imperial cry has been used for party purpose. He has no use for politics at Ottawa. The naval question is nothing to him. He wants neither to subscribe money nor to build ships. Europe is very far away, and he is too ignorant to realize his close connection with her. He has strong views, however, on a tariff which only affects him by perpetually raising the cost of living and farming. The ideas of even a conservative in the West about reducing the tariff would make an Eastern Liberal die of heart failure. And the Westerner also hates the banks. The banking system of Canada is peculiar, and throws the control of the banks into the hands of a few people in the East, who were felt, by the ever-optimistic West, to have shut down credit too completely during the recent money stringency. The most interesting expression of the new Western point of view, and in many ways the most hopeful movement in Canada, is the cooperative movement among the grain growers of the 3 prairie provinces. Only started a few years ago, it has grown rapidly in numbers, wealth, power, and extent of operations. So far it has confined itself politically to influencing provincial legislatures, but it has gradually attached itself to an advanced radical program of a Chartist description, and it is becoming powerful. Whether the outcome will be a very desirable rejuvenation of the Liberal party, or the creation of a third, perhaps Radical Labour, party, it is hard to tell. At any rate, the change will come. And just to start with, there will very shortly come to the Eastern powers, who threw out reciprocity with the States for the sake of the Empire, a demand from the West that the preference to British goods be increased rapidly till they be allowed to come in free, also for the Empire's sake. Then the fun will begin. End of Letter 9. Letter 10 of Letters from America by Rupert Brooke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Letter 10, Outside. I had visited New York, Boston, Quebec, Montreal, and Toronto. In Winnipeg I found a friend who was tired of cities. So was I. In Canada the remedy lies close at hand. We took ancient clothes, and I, Ben Jonson, and Jane Austen to keep me English, and departed northward for a lodge, reported to exist in a region of lakes and hills and forest and caribou and Indians and a few people. At first the train sauntered through a smiling plain, intermittently cultivated, and dotted with little new villages. Over this country are thrown little pools of that flood of European immigration that pours through Winnipeg, to remain separate or be absorbed as destiny wills. The problem of immigration here reveals that purposelessness that exists in the affairs of Canada even more than those of other nations. The multitude from South or East Europe flocks in. Some make money and return. The most remain, often in inassimilable lumps. There is every sign that these lumps may poison the health of Canada as dangerously as they have that of the United States. For Canada there is the peril of too large an element of foreign blood and traditions in a small nation already little more than half composed of British blood and descent. Nationalities seem to teach one another only their worst. If the Italians gave the Canadians of their good manners, and the Doukhobors or Poles inoculated them with idealism and the love of beauty, and received from them British romanticism and sense of responsibility. But they only seem to increase the anarchy, these foreigners, and to learn the American twang and method of spitting. And there is the peril of politics. Upon these scattered exotic communities, ignorant of the problems of their adopted land, ignorant even of its language, swoop the agents of political parties with their one effectual argument: bad whiskey. This baptism is the immigrants' only organized welcome into their new liberties. Occasionally some church raises a thin protest, but the Anglo-Saxon continues to take up his burden, and the floods from Europe pour in. Canadians regard this influx with that queer fatalism which men adopt under plutocracy. How could they stop it? It pays the steamship and railway companies. It may, or may not, be good for Canada. Who knows? In any case it will go on. Our masters wish it. It is noteworthy that Icelanders are found to be far the readiest to mingle and become Canadian. After them, Norwegians and Swedes. With other immigrant nationalities, hope lies with the younger generation, but these acclimatize immediately. Our train was boarded by a crowd of Ruthenians or Galicians, brown-eyed and beautiful people, not yet wholly civilized out of their own costume. The girls chatted together in a swift, lovely language, and the children danced about, tossing their queer brown mops of hair. They clattered out at a little village that seemed to belong to them, and stood waving and laughing us out of sight. I pondered on their feelings, and looked for the name of the little utopia these aliens had found in a new world. It was called, for the railway companies name towns in this country, Milner. We wandered into rougher country, where the rocks begin to show through the surface, and scrub pine abounds. At the end of our side line was another, and at the end of that a village, the ultimate outpost of civilization. Here, on the way back, some weeks later, we had to spend the night in a little hotel which accommodated transients. It was a rough affair of planks, inhabited by whatever wandering workmen from construction camps or other labor in the region wanted shelter for the night. You slept in a sort of dormitory, each bed partitioned off from the rest by walls that were some feet short of the ceiling. Swedes, Germans, Welsh, Italians, and Poles occupied the other partitions, each blaspheming the works of the Lord in his own language. About midnight 2 pairs of feet crashed into the cell opposite mine, and a high, sleepless voice, with an accent I knew, continued an interminable argument on theology. "I beginning washword," it proclaimed with all the melancholy of drunkenness. The other disputant was German or Norwegian, and uninterested, though very kindly. "Right-o," he said. "Let's go sleep." "What word?" pondered the Englishman. The Norwegian suggested several sleepily. "Logos," wailed the other. "What Logos?" and wept. They persisted, hour by hour, disconnected voices in the void and darkness, lonely and chance companions in the back blocks of Canada, the one who couldn't, and the one who didn't want to, understand. A little before dawn I woke again. That thin voice, in patient soliloquy, was discussing female suffrage, going very far down into the roots of the matter. I met its owner next morning. He was tall and dark and lachrymose, with bloodshot eyes, and breath that stank of gin. He had played scrum half for College in '98, and had prepared for ordination. "You'll understand, old man," he said, "how out of place I am amongst this scum. Hoi polloi! We're not of the hoi polloi, are we?" It seemed nicer to agree. "Oh, I know Greek," he was too eagerly the gentleman. "Ho kosmos teth adikias." The last thing I learnt for ordination, this world of injustice. That's right, isn't it? He laughed sickly. "I say, as one 'varsity man to another, we're not hoi polloi. Could you lend me some money?" We had to press on 30 miles up a light railway to a power station, a settlement by a waterfall in the wild. An engine and an ancient luggage van conveyed us. The van held us, 3 crates, and some sacks, 4 half-breeds in black slouch hats, who curled up on the floor like dogs and slept, and an aged Italian. This last one knew no words of English. He had travelled all the way from Naples, heaven knows how, to find his 2 sons, supposed to be working in the power station. So much was written on a piece of paper. We gave him chocolate, and at intervals I repeated to him my only Italian, the first line of the Divina Commedia. He seemed cheered. The van jolted on through the fading light. Once a man stepped out on to the track, stopped us, and clambered silently up. We went on. It was the doctor, who had been visiting some lonely hut in the woods. Later another figure was seen staggering between the rails. We slowed up, shouted, and finally stopped, butting him gently on the back with our buffer and causing him to fall. He was very drunk. The driver and the doctor helped him into the van. There he stood, and looking round said very distinctly, "I do not wish to travel on your blankety-blank train." So we put him off again, and proceeded. Such is the West. We rattled interminably through the darkness. The unpeopled woods closed about us, snatched with lean branches, and opened out again to a windy space. Once or twice the ground fell away, and there was, for a moment, the mysterious gleam and stir of water. Canadian stars are remote and virginal. Every one slumbered. Arrival at the great concrete building and the little shacks of the power station shook us to our feet. The Italian vanished into the darkness. Whether he found his sons or fell into the river no one knew, and no one seemed to care. An Indian, taciturn and Mongolian, led us next day by boat and on foot to the lonely log house we aimed at. It stood on high rocks above a lake 6 miles by 2. There was an Indian somewhere, by a river 3 miles west, and a trapper to the east, and a family encamped on an island in the lake. Else nobody. It is that feeling of fresh loneliness that impresses itself before any detail of the wild. The soul, or the personality, seems to have indefinite room to expand. There is no one else within reach, there never has been anyone. No one else is thinking of the lakes and hills you see before you. They have no tradition, no names even. They are only pools of water and lumps of earth. Some day, perhaps, to be clothed with loves and memories and the comings and goings of men, but now dumbly waiting their Wordsworth or their Acropolis to give them individuality and a soul. In such country as this there is a rarefied, clean sweetness. The air is unbreathed and the earth untrodden. All things share this childlike loveliness, the gray whispering reeds, the pure blue of the sky, the birches and thin fir trees that make up these forests, even the brisk touch of the clear water as you dive. The last sensation, indeed, and none of sight or hearing, has impressed itself as the token of Canada, the land. Every swimmer knows it. It is not languorous, like bathing in a warm southern sea, nor grateful, like a river in a hot climate, nor strange, as the ocean always is, nor startling, like very cold water. But it touches the body continually with freshness, and it seems to be charged with a subtle and unexhausted energy. It is colorless, faintly stinging, hard and gray like the rocks around, full of vitality and sweet. It has the tint and sensation of a pale dawn before the sun is up. Such is the wild of Canada. It awaits the sun, the end for which Heaven made it, the blessing of civilization. Some day it will be sold in large portions, and the timber given to a friend of Blank's, and cut down and made into paper, on which shall be printed the praise of prosperity. And the land itself shall be divided into town lots and sold, and subdivided and sold again, and boomed and resold, and boosted and distributed to fishy young men who will vend it in distant parts of the country. And then such portions as can never be built upon shall be given in exchange for great sums of money to old ladies in the quieter parts of England, but the central parts of towns shall remain in the hands of the wise. And on these shall churches, hotels, and a great many ugly skyscrapers be built, and hovels for the poor, and houses for the rich, none beautiful, and there shall be ugly objects to be manufactured rather hurriedly, and sold to the people at more than they are worth, because similar and cheaper objects made in other countries are kept out by a tariff. But at present there are only the wrinkled, gray-blue lake, sliding ever sideways, and the gray rocks, and the cliffs and hills covered with birch trees, and the fresh wind among the birches, and quiet, and that unseizable virginity. Dawn is always a lost pearly glow in the ashen skies, and sunset a multitude of softly tinted mists sliding before a remotely golden west. They follow one another with an infinite loneliness, and there is a far and solitary beach of dark, golden sand, close by a deserted Indian camp, where if you drift quietly round the corner in a canoe, you may see a bear stumbling along, or a great caribou, or a little red deer coming down to the water to drink, treading the wild edge of the lake and forest with a light, secret, and melancholy grace. End of Letter 10. Letter 11 of Letters from America by Rupert Brooke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Letter 11, The Prairies. I passed the last few hours of the westward journey from Winnipeg to Regina in daylight, the daylight of a wet and cheerless Sunday. The car was half empty, in possession of a family of small children and some theatrical ladies and gentlemen from the United States, traveling on one-night stands, who were collectively called the world-renowned Barbary Pirates. We jogged limply from little village to little village, each composed of little brown log shacks, with a few buildings of tin and corrugated iron, and even of brick, and several grain elevators. Each village I beg your pardon, town seems to be exactly like the next. They differ a little in size, from populations of 100 to nearly 2,000, and in age, for some have buildings dating almost back to the 19th century, and a few are still mostly tents. They seemed all to be emptied of their folk this Sabbath morn, though whether the inhabitants were at work or in church, or had shot themselves from depression induced by the weather, it was impossible to tell. These little towns do not look to the passer-by comfortable as homes. Partly there is the difficulty of distinguishing your village from the others. It would be as bad as being married to a Jap. And then towns should be on hills or in valleys, however small. A town dumped down, apparently by chance, on a flat expanse, wears the same air of discomfort as a man trying to make his bed on a level, unyielding surface, such as a lawn or pavement. He feels hopelessly incidental to the superficies of the earth. He is aware that the human race has thigh bones. Yet this country is not quite flat, as I had been led to expect. It does not give you that feeling of a plain you have in parts of Lombardy and Holland and Belgium. This may have been due to the gray mist and drizzle which curtained off the horizon, but the land was always very slightly rolling, and sometimes almost as uneven as a Surrey common. At first it seemed to be given to mixed farming a good deal; afterwards to wheat, oats, and barley; but a great part is uncultivated prairie land, grass, with sparse bushes and patches of brushwood, and a few rare trees, and continual clumps of large golden daisies. Occasional rough black roads wind through the brush and into the towns, and die into grass tracks along the wire fences. The day I went through, the interminable oblique thin rain took the gold out of the wheat and the brown from the distant fields and bushes, and drabbed all the colors in the grass. The children in the car cried to each other with the shrill, sick persistency of tired childhood. "How many inches to Regina?" "A billion." "A trillion." "A shillion." The Barbary Pirates laughed incessantly. It seemed to me that the prairie would be a lonely place to live in, especially if it rained; but the people who have lived there for years tell me they get very homesick if they go away for a time. Valleys and hills seem to them petty, fretful, unlovable. The magic of the plains has them in thrall. Certainly there is a little more democracy in the west of Canada than the east. The communities seem a little less incapable of looking after themselves. Out in the west they are erecting not despicable public buildings, founding universities, running a few public services. That politics has a voice in these undertakings does not make them valueless. There are perceptible in the prairies, among all the corruption, irresponsibility, and disastrous individualism, some faint signs of the sense of the community. Take a very good test, the public libraries. As you traverse Canada from east to west, they steadily improve. You begin in the city of Montreal, which is unable to support one, and pass through the dingy rooms and inadequate intellectual provisions of Toronto and Winnipeg. After that the prairies and reading rooms, small for the smaller cities, are cleaner and better kept, show signs of care and intelligence, until at last in Calgary you find a very neat and carefully kept building, stocked with an immense variety of periodicals and an admirably chosen store of books, ranging from the classics to the most utterly modern literature. Few large English towns could show anything as good. Cross the Rockies to Vancouver, and you're back among dirty walls, grubby furniture, and inadequate literature again. There's nothing in Canada to compare with the magnificent libraries little New Zealand can show, but Calgary is hopeful. These cities grow in population with unimaginable velocity. From 30 to 30,000 in 15 years is the usual rate. Pavements are laid down, stores and bigger stores and still bigger stores spring up. Trams buzz along the streets towards the unregarded horizon that lies across the end of most roads in these flat, geometrically planned prairie towns. Probably a Chinese quarter appears, and the beginnings of slums. Expensive and pleasant small dwelling houses fringe the outskirts, and rents being so high, great edifices of residential flats rival the great stores. In other streets, or even sandwiched between the finer buildings, are dingy and decaying saloons and innumerable little booths and hovels where adventurers deal dishonestly in real estate and employment bureaus. And there are the vast erections of the great corporations, Hudson's Bay Company, and the banks and the railways, and sometimes, almost equally impressive, the public buildings. There are the beginnings of very costly universities, and Regina has built a superb great House of Parliament with a wide sheet of water in front of it, a noble building. The inhabitants of these cities are proud of them, and envious of each other with a bitter rivalry. They do not love their cities as a Manchester man loves Manchester, or a Münchner Munich, for they have probably lately arrived in them, and will surely pass on soon. But while they are there, they love them, and with no silent love. They boost. To boost is to commend outrageously, and each cries up his own city, both from pride, it would appear, and for profit. For the fortunes of Neuville are very really the fortunes of its inhabitants. From the successful speculator, owner of whole blocks, to the waiter bringing you a martini, who has paid up a fraction of the cost of a quarter share in a town lot, all are the richer as well as the prouder if Neuville grows. It is imperative to praise Edmonton in Edmonton, but it is sudden death to praise it in Calgary. The partisans of each city proclaim its superiority to all the others in swiftness of growth, future population, size of buildings, price of land, by all recognized standards of excellence. I traveled from Edmonton to Calgary in the company of a citizen of Edmonton and a citizen of Calgary. Hour after hour they disputed. Land in Calgary had risen from $5 to $300, but in Edmonton from $3 to $500. Edmonton had grown from 30 persons to 40,000 in 20 years, but Calgary from 20 to 30,000 in 12. Where, as a respite, did I come from? I had to tell them, not without shame, that my own town of Grantchester, having numbered 300 at the time of Julius Caesar's landing, had risen rapidly to nearly 4 by Domesday Book, and was now declined to 350. They seemed perplexed and angry. Sentimental people in the East will talk of the romance of the West, and of these simple, brave pioneers who have wrung a living from the soil, and are properly proud of the rude little towns that mark their conquest over nature. That may apply to the frontiers of civilization up north, but the prairie towns have progressed beyond all that. A few of the old pioneers of the West survive to watch with startled eyes the wonderful fruits of the seed they sowed. Such are among the finest people in Canada, very different from the younger generation, with wider interests, good talkers, the best of company. From them and from records one can learn of the early settlers and the beginnings of the Northwest Mounted Police. The police seem to have been superb. For no great reward but the love of the thing, they imposed order and fairness upon half a continent. The Indians trusted them utterly. They were without fear. A store stands now in Calgary where 40 years ago a policeman was shot to death by a murderer, followed over 1,000 miles. He knew that the criminal would shoot, but it was the rule of the Mounted Police not to fire first. Wounded, he killed his man, then died. And there was the case of the desperado who crossed the border and was eventually captured and held by an immense force of American police and military. They awaited a regiment of the police to conduct the villain back to trial. 2 appeared, and being asked, "Where is the escort?" replied, "We are the escort." and started back their 500 miles' ride with the murderer in tow. And there were the two who pursued a horse thief from Dawson down to Minneapolis, caught him, and took him back to Dawson to be hanged. And there was the settler who... The tragedy of the West is that these men have passed, and that what they lived and died to secure for their race is now the foundation for a gigantic national gambling of a most unprofitable and disastrous kind. Hordes of people, who mostly seem to come from the great neighboring Commonwealth and are inspired with the national hunger for getting rich quickly without deserving it, prey on the community by their dealings in what is humorously called real estate. For them our fathers died. What a sowing and what a harvest! And where good men worked or perished is now a row of little shops, all devoted to the sale of town lots in some distant spot that must infallibly become a great city in the next 2 years, and in the doorway of each lounges a thin-chested, much-spitting youth with a flabby face, shifty eyes, and an inhuman mouth, who invites you continually, with the most raucous of American accents, to "step inside and examine our proposition." End of Letter 11. Letter 12 of Letters from America by Rupert Brooke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Letter 12. The Indians. When I was in the East, I got to know a man who had spent many years of his life living among the Indians. He showed me his photographs. He explained one of an old woman. He said, "They told me there was an old woman in the camp called Laughing Earth. When I heard the name, I just said, 'Take me to her.' She wouldn't be photographed. She kept turning her back to me. I just picked up a clod and plugged it at her and said, 'Turn around, Laughing Earth.' She turned half round and grinned. She was a game old bird. I joshed all the boys here Laughing Earth was my girl, till they saw her photo. There stands Laughing Earth in brightly colored petticoat and blouse, her gray hair blowing about her. Her back is towards you, but her face is turned, and scarcely hidden by a hand that is raised with all the coyness of 70 years. Laughter shines from the infinitely lined, round, brown cheeks, and from the mouth, and from the dancing eyes, and floods and spills over from each of the innumerable wrinkles. Laughing Earth! There is endless vitality in that laughter. The hand and face and the old body laugh. No skinny intellectual mirth affecting but the lips, it was the merriment of an apple bobbing on the bough, or a brown stream running over rocks, or any other gay creature of earth. And withal was a great dignity, invulnerable to clods, and a kindly and noble beauty. By the light of that laughter much becomes clear: the right place of man upon earth, the entire suitability in life of very brightly colored petticoats, and the fact that old age is only a different kind of a merriment from youth, and a wiser. And by that light the fragments of this pathetic race become more comprehensible, and perhaps less pathetic. The wanderer in Canada sees them from time to time, the further west he goes, irrelevant and inscrutable figures. In the East, French and Scotch half-breeds frequent the borders of civilization. In any western town you may chance on a brave and his wife and baby, resplendent in gay blankets and trappings, sliding gravely through the hideousness of the new order that has supplanted them. And there will be a few half-breeds loitering at the corners of the streets. These people of mixed race generally seem unfortunate in the first generation. A few of the older ones, the old-timers, have made good, and hold positions in the society for which they pioneered. But most appear to inherit the weaknesses of both sides. Drink does its work, and the nobler ones, like the tragic figure of that poetess who died recently, Pauline Johnson, seem fated to be at odds with the world. The happiest, whether Indian or half-breed, are those who live beyond the ever-advancing edges of cultivation and order, and force a livelihood from nature by hunting and fishing. Go anywhere into the wild, and you will find in little clearings, by lake or river, a dilapidated hut with a family of these solitaries, friendly with the pioneers or trappers around, ready to act as guide on hunt or trail. The government, extraordinarily painstaking and well-intentioned, has established Indian schools and trained some of them to take their places in the civilization we have built. Not the best Indians these, say lovers of the race. I have met them as clerks or stenographers, only distinguishable from their neighbors by a darker skin and a sweeter voice and manner. And in a generation or two, I suppose, the strain mingles and is lost. So we finish with kindness what our fathers began with war. The government and others have scientifically studied the history and characteristics of the Indians and written them down in books, lest it be forgotten that human beings could be so extraordinary. They were a wandering race, it appears, of many tribes and even languages. Not apt to arts or crafts, they had and have an unrefined delight in bright colors. They enjoyed a nature worship, believed rather dimly in a presiding power, and very definitely in certain ethical and moral rules. One of their incomprehensible customs was that, at certain intervals, the tribe divided itself into two factitious divisions, each headed by various chiefs, and gambled furiously for many days, one party against the other. They were pugnacious, and in their uncivilized way fought frequent wars. They were remarkably loyal to each other and treacherous to the foe, brave and very stoical. Monogamy was very prevalent. It is remarked that husbands and wives were very fond of each other, and the great body of scientific opinion favors the theory that mothers were much attached to their children. Most tribes were very healthy, and some fine-looking. Such were the remarkable people who hunted, fought, feasted, and lived here until the light came and all was changed. Other qualities they had, even more remarkable to a European, such as utter honesty and complete devotion to the truth among themselves. Civilization, disease, alcohol, and vice have reduced them to a few scattered communities and some stragglers, and a legend, the admiration of boyhood. Boys they were, pugnacious, hunters, loyal and cruel, older than the merrier children of the South Seas, younger and simpler than the weedy, furtive, acquisitive youth who may figure our age and type. "We must be a morally higher race than the Indians," said an earnest American business man to me in Saskatoon, "because we have survived them. The great Darwin has proved it." I visited later a community of our moral inferiors, an Indian reservation under the shade of the Rockies. The government has put aside various tracts of land where the Indians may conduct their lives in something of their old way, and stationed in each an agent to protect their interests. For every white man, as an agent told me, thinks an Indian legitimate prey for all forms of cheating and robbery. The reservations are the better in proportion as they are further from the towns and cities. The one I saw was peopled by a few hundred Stonies, one of the finest and most untouched of the tribes. Of these Laughing Earth had made one, but alas, a few years before she had become a portion of the mirthfulness that once she made more mirthful. The Indians occupy themselves with a little farming and hunting, and with expeditions, and live in 2 or 3 small scattered villages of huts and tents. But the center of the community is the little whitewashed house where the agent has his office. Here we sat, he and I, and talked, behind the counter. The agent is father, mother, clergyman, tutor, physician, solicitor, and banker to the Indians. They wandered in and out of the place with their various requests. The most part of them could not talk English, but there was generally some young Indian to interpret. An old chief entered. His gray hair curled down to his broad shoulders. He had a noble forehead, brown, steady eyes, a thin, humorous mouth. His cow had been run over by the C.P.R. What was to be done? And how much could he get? The affair was discussed through an interpreter, a Canadianized young Indian in trousers, who spat. Some of the men, especially the older ones, have wonderful dignity and beauty of face and body. Their physique is superb, their features shaped and lined by weather and experience into a Roman nobility that demands respect. Several such passed through. Then came an old woman, wizened and loquacious, bent double by the sack of her weekly provisions of meat and flour. She required oil, was given it, secreted it in some cranny of the many-colored bundle that she was, and staggered creakily off again. The office emptied for a while, then drifted in a younger man, tall, with the brown, dog-like expression of simplicity many Indians wear. He was covered by a large, gray-colored blanket over his other clothes. He puffed at a pipe and stared out of the window. The agent and I continued talking. You must never hurry an Indian. Presently he gave a little grunt. The agent said, "Well, John?" John went on smoking. 5 minutes later, in the middle of our conversation, John said suddenly, "Salt." He was staring inexpressively at the ceiling. "Why, John," said the agent, "I gave you enough salts on Thursday to last you a week." John directed his gaze on us and smoked dumbly. "Still the stomach?" inquired the agent genially. John's expression became gradually grimmer, and he moved one hand slowly across till it rested on his stomach. An impassive, significant hand. After a courteous pause, the agent rose, poured some Epsom salts out of a large jar, wrapped them in paper, and handed them over. John secreted them dispassionately in some pouch among the skins and blankets that wrapped him in. We went back to our conversation. 5 minutes after, he grunted suddenly. Again 5 minutes, and he departed. His wife, a plump, patient young woman, and his solemn-eyed, fat, ridiculous son of 4 were sitting stolidly on the grass outside. It obviously made no difference if he took 1 hour or 7 over his business. They mounted their tiny ponies and trotted briskly off. I suppose one is apt to be sentimental about these good people. They're really so picturesque, they trail clouds of Fenimore Cooper, and they seem, for all their unfitness, reposefully more in touch with permanent things than the America that has succeeded them. And it is interesting to watch our pathetic efforts to prevent or disarm the effects of ourselves. What will happen? Shall we preserve these few bands of them untouched to succeed us ultimately when the grasp of our civilization weakens and our transient anarchy in these wilder lands recedes once more before the older anarchy of nature? Or will they be entirely swallowed up by that ugliness of shops and trousers with which we enchain the earth, and become a memory and less than a memory? They are that already. The Indians have passed. They left no arts, no tradition, no buildings or roads or laws, only a story or two, and a few names, strange and beautiful. The ghosts of the old chiefs must surely chuckle when they note that the name by which Canada has called her capital and the center of her political life, Ottawa, is an Indian name which signifies buying and selling. And the wanderer in this land will always be remarking an unexplained fragrance about the place names, as from some flower which has withered and which he does not know. End of Letter 12.